Test real quick.
This works. It does.
Does it work?
You can get started.
Okay. So thank you for your talk. It's very, very insightful. Obviously, the audience really enjoyed it. And as I mentioned, there was a question about not hiding the mistakes we make as scientists. And that is the perfect segue to this session, because you had a paper that you were a part of get retracted relatively recently that generated a lot of discussion in the blogosphere, in newspaper articles, and the like, and talking about what happened. So one of the ways I'd like you to start out is for those of our audience that have not been keeping up on that, can you kind of explain what happened from the conceptualization of the manuscript through where we are today?
Yeah, happy to do that. So this is a project that occurred over a 9-year time span. It was a prospective replication project. So my lab, it actually started before COS existed. My lab and 3 other labs decided to do a project where we would do our discovery work in each of our labs, and then once we thought we had a discovery, we would enter it into a round-robin replication where each lab would try to replicate the original finding. And the overall idea of the project was as a complement to these investigations, like I showed you before, where we'd taken a sample of literature and tried to replicate findings and found that often we failed to replicate those findings. In this case, we said, let's adopt all of these practices that we talked about, the solutions on that earlier slide, except register reports. That didn't exist yet. But let's adopt all of these and see if we can get our findings to replicate in this round-robin format. And if we can't, that'll be really interesting, because it means there are other factors that are influencing why effects tend to go away. But if these solutions themselves collectively are sufficient, then we might observe high replicability in these findings. So that was a general concept that we pursued and spent several years conducting the research. We published it in 2023, and not long after publication, readers who, this is post peer review now, readers looked at it and said, lots of debates about the substance of the claims in the normal way, but then also noted there's a claim in the paper that's a surprising claim, and it said everything in this research is pre-registered. The individual experiments, there ended up being 80 of those, 16 discoveries, and then 64 replications. Those were all pre-registered. But then the paper summarizing all of the analyses across, combining all of these, only a small portion of the analyses from that were pre-registered, but the paper claimed everything was. So it was false. Paper made a false claim that could mislead readers into thinking, oh, this was, more of these analyses were planned than were actually planned. Now, the critiques also had other things that they were concerned about, some of which we agreed with, some of which we didn't. But for us, this was the core issue that we agreed with was a problem. The journal decided that the challenges for the paper were sufficiently important to deal with, that instead of just issuing a correction, which is just tagging a short summary of what problems were as a separate publication from the original paper, that the paper should be retracted, and then they invited us to revise it and submit it again to go back through review for republication after addressing the errors. So that, in its basic sense, is a success story. It's a failure of our part because we made a fundamental error that misled readers. But as a self-corrective process of identifying that error and addressing it, it was a success in addressing challenges that really do exist in the literature. Errors happen, and this was an important one. So I can go into any other deeper, but there's a short version.
Thank you. So that leads me to my first substantive question of how should we approach registration, because there are scientists that view registration as on this day, this is what we're thinking. And then there are scientists that approach registration as the fundamental foundation from which you cannot deviate. You
Right.
must build on top of that. And in other conversations, I've certainly had other descriptions of that are more editorialized. But how do you think science and psychology should do this?
Great question. So for me, the primary purpose of registration is transparency and nothing else. Do whatever research you want to do it the way you think it's right, make any change that you want. You said you pre-registered this and then you did that. Fine. You're the researcher. You know best, we assume. So do the work you want to do. And the pre-registration allows for the transparency so that you 6 months from now can say, oh, I plan to do that. Oh, wow. Okay. And then a reader 2 years from now can look at it and said, oh, they plan to do that. And then they did this. Okay. And evaluate the merits of the research based on that. The challenge, I think great to call it out, is that once we pre-register, we feel like we can't change things. We feel we've just made a public statement. This is what we're going to do. And if I deviate from it, then that's a failure. And it's not a failure. It's well, I guess it can be a failure. You can deviate for reasons that were failures, but deviation itself is not a problem. Failing to disclose it is the problem. So we deviate from things all the time when plans change. And in the registered reports model relating to that, the instruction to authors once they've gotten the pre-commitment is not you cannot change anything. It's if you need to change something, sampling changed, a situation changed with measures, then report it to the editor. Say, this is what's changing, this is why it's changing, this is what I need to change. And the editor might say, oh, wow, that really alters things. We need to rethink. Or they might say, yeah, that makes sense. Just make sure you disclose the change, and then the reviewers will assess that at the end. So the flexibility is needed in the reality of research. And pre-registration is not meant to be, as Alex DeHaven on our team has said in a paper, pre-registration is a plan, not a prison. Don't feel chained to your pre-registration. Recognize it's a plan. And of course, if you're able to follow through with that plan, fantastic. You know, it's amazing. You planned it out. You did it exactly as you said, and you reported saying, that's what we said we would do. That's what we did. That's a great achievement. It speaks well to your project management skills and your execution. And then sometimes your plan goes awry for lots of reasons that are outside of your control, or some that maybe you should have had control over, but you didn't. And like, oops, okay, this is what happened. This is why it happened. And here's what we think we can still conclude following that. Does that tackle it?
Questions from the audience? They're online or?
So I will just report an online question that came in. It came in at the end of the last talk, so it might apply to both. The perception that others in the same discipline have more self-interested research efforts than themselves is interesting. How can discourse be opened around this issue, and how could transparency alleviate this issue?
That's a great question. So if those of you that are affiliated in some way with social psychology might recall the term pluralistic ignorance, where we don't recognize the beliefs and values of others in our communities. And this is exactly what this phenomenon is. So we see this in every survey that we do about support for open science, like the one that I showed you. How much do you support open data? How much do you support pre-registration? How much does your community support it? Everyone underestimates how much their community supports it compared with the survey data that we have. What is the best mechanism for addressing pluralistic ignorance? It's showing people the data, right? You thought that only 15% of your community supports pre-registration. Turns out 55% of your community supports pre-registration. Isn't that interesting? And as soon as you have that insight, you say, oh, that's weird. Why did I think so few did? Well, I thought so few did because nobody talks about it. I don't see people doing it. I don't see others that might help me do it. So maybe if I did it, then I might inspire others to do it, and we can very rapidly shift that norm. These strategies are used in health communications, right? To like kids for underage drinking, right? Everybody thinks, oh, everybody drinks at school. I'm the only one. And then you show them the data. Oh, it turns out not everybody's drinking. Oh, okay. I don't feel the same degree of pressure for that. Right? We can use these principles that we study in the world on ourselves. Super easy. Maybe it's not super easy, but it's super effective. Thanks for that question, whoever asked it. Internet.
Hi. How may the new process of peer reviews and transparency may allow research to be more uh, accessible to the general population? Because I know sometimes when you're reading psychological journals, they're not really understandable for the general population, though these populations do want to learn more about this information or the study.
That's a great question. So it is really important to figure out how we can do better at giving the research away to actually have the impact for practitioners, for policymakers, for general public, because a lot of what we do is relevant for those communities. I wouldn't put it into the peer review process itself, where the improvement needs to be, nor would I necessarily put it on every individual researcher. My orientation tends to be let people play to their strengths and interests. So if you want to write obscure papers that are hard for anybody outside of your specialty to understand, knock yourself out. That's great. And let's make sure that there are career pathways for people who are willing to read your esoteric work and figure out how is it that others might care about that. And I want to write about that. So science journalism, fantastic, very important part of our research ecosystem. They are really, really good at translating a lot of dense material into digestible material for the public. Of course, they make errors too, and we need to support and improve that, and we need to improve those pathways. But what I want more generally, from my perspective, is a culture that has those pathways built in so that we can get that translation like you described. So thanks for offering that.
Thank you.
And to follow up on what Brian is saying, it is really, really hard to write for multiple constituencies. In my career, the only scientist I can think of offhand that is good at writing for every audience is Bob Cialdini. And he has been fantastic in his textbooks, in his scientific articles of being approachable. But the fact that I have one name I can think of speaks to how challenging it is. And it's something we need to be better about as scientists, is being mindful of who we are writing for, because undergraduates read lots of our articles and often we leave you to struggle with no guidance based on our writing style.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Shay and I attend Colorado State University, Pueblo. I'm a senior out there and I'm very lucky and blessed to have the Institute of Cannabis Research on my campus. And with that inspiration, I became a cannabis studies minor. And this is a question for you and for the nice chair back here. In regards to cannabis research, there isn't a lot of openness for that in America right now in regards to mental health and physical health. Do either one of you see cannabis research becoming more open with your background in social work? Do you see it becoming more open? Do you see research becoming more than just like, I think Harmony said it, like with the surveys? That's kind of all that we can do with my research right now. So what are your thoughts on furthering that?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think areas that have been underrepresented visibly in the research discussion have the most to benefit from greater openness. The challenge is, how do you cultivate those cultures within those communities? Because it's often within very small sub-communities that have their own norms, and sometimes if they're small enough, they even is intensive competition within the community. So, right, so the institute that you're associated with may feel like there's no way we're sharing our stuff because the folks over at Virginia Tech or whatever, they'll steal it. And you're like, well, come on, let's. So some of it is a potential for a very small efforts on collective action of getting people that are leaders in that community to talk amongst each other and solve that problem of, oh, I assume no one else wants to share. And if they all say, well, I would share if you shared, okay, then maybe it is that we can go more open. We can make this stuff more accessible to the broader community. And we've had that, observed that several different times in communities that once you get some key players or visible players starting to do it, then everybody else says, oh, hey, maybe this is a thing we can do now. And it becomes a norm relatively quickly. So I suspect there's great opportunity there. If you have any people that have any interest and leverage and you want to direct them to us, we're happy to try to help.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm a senior at Florida Southern College. My name's Annabelle, and I was wondering if you had any like recommendations for introducing these open methods to like professors or other students.
Great question. I find the easiest way is often a reading group, either popular press articles, there's lots of them about these topics, or some of the academic papers that are wrestling with these issues. Like the part that I opened with, I have a paper series called the Scientific Utopia Papers that I often will use as an entry point to starting to discuss these topics. There's others that are more recent that talk about the issues in a broader way and more up-to-date way. So that is often a very good entry point because it's familiar. It's like, we're just going to read a paper and talk about it. We do that all the time. Okay. Oh, and now it's about how we do our work. Oh, that's interesting. Let's discuss it. And it is useful to have one or two people that are prepared in the sense that they know what the major issues are and the major objections, because the major objections that come up are almost the same almost every time. And many of them have actual evidence-based answers rather than, oh, yeah, that's a good point. We don't know how to deal with that. Like, well, we can't share everything. That's true. There are reasons for privacy and commercialization that you can't share everything. But here's how the policies have dealt with that, for example. So that can make it very useful so that the conversation turns from one of, well, we don't do things that way, so we can't possibly do it, to, oh, okay, I see that some people are doing things that way. How would this be incorporated into our work? Should it be? How would it be? And that can be very useful. So that's one idea. Another idea is to invite someone to your campus that's close enough by that talks about these issues and can be an external rah-rah to sort of stimulate the conversation. So thanks.
Thank you.
I also think it's worth noting that when it comes to like registered reports, faculty have done this already, even if they don't know it, because anybody who's done a thesis, anybody who's done a dissertation, and even at my university, our senior projects, they have a proposal and they have a defense version. That is the essence of registered reports, where I have an idea, let's make it as strong as it can be. And then when you propose your thesis, when you propose your dissertation, your graduation is in no way dependent on the specific results you find. It's, are you interpreting it correctly? I find that is a great way to find that in with faculty, is tell them they already have experience with it, even if they don't realize it. In open methods, we've all had conversations, even if we haven't put things on the OSF. We've all shared our methods. This isn't as revolutionary as it can seem at first blush.
Thank you.
Just related to that, like the pre-registration kind of sounds similar to like the IRB process.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious what you guys think about like similarities and differences between them.
Yes, there are similarities in what gets in pre-commitment. The most IRB processes are less substantive on analysis plans, how you're going to approach, interpret the data, and more just descriptive of what the procedures are. But there is a lot of overlap. So if you're preparing an IRB, you'll see in the pre-registration templates a lot of opportunity to reuse that content without having to draft it all over again. So they're a nice addition. We've been exploring different ideas of like, can we integrate these into a single process? Can we make it super easy for people to fill out their pre-registration and then click a button that automatically submits it to their IRB for approval? And then their IRB approves back, all the sorts of things. It's like, how do we lower the burden by having the system solve some of these problems? That's not coming this year. So sorry, I made some like, God.
And it jogs my memory of something else that would have said is when it comes to doing registrations, it's all stuff you're going to be doing anyway.
Later, yes.
It's going to be a part of your paper in terms of the theoretical background. It's not wasted effort. It's shifting where you do effort.
That's right.
But it's not really fundamentally changing anything.
Hi, I got a question more regards about the multidisciplinary aspect of this. I'm a psychology professor at a small university in South Carolina, but we do a lot of collaboration with the criminology and sociology department. So I know we talked a lot about the psychology aspect of it, but how does that relate to other disciplines as well?
Yeah, great question. These issues are pervasive in terms of what the reward system is. It's the same in criminology and sociology. Some book orientation is heavier in the sociology community than in psychology. So, it sort of can manifest in different ways how that social system operates. But the fundamentals are still pretty similar across fields. And even outside of our social behavioral science world, a lot of those same issues crop up. The challenge that we've experienced, and you may have some insight on this given that you are collaborating across these, is that the siloing is so hard to navigate, right? Those changes, those conversations that occur among psychologists, the sociologists say, what are you talking about? I don't have no idea what you're talking about. I never heard of that thing. And so and using different words for the same idea, right? Terminology, like, oh, we call that same, the jargon is so heavy. So that is something that we've been working really hard ourselves to try to bridge. How do we create universal terms? How do we create shared standards? How do we customize when we need to, but universalize when we can? And that goes for both the interventions, trying to get communities to change, and just even like how the OSF works, right? Clinical trials, they call them treatment arms. We call them experimental conditions. Somebody else calls them something else. Like, oh my God, we got to figure out how to get everybody online. So thanks for raising that. It's a really challenging issue.
Okay. So I have a question kind of coming back to when you have a retraction in particular, but also applies to submitting for publication. For example, with the NICE projects, your name goes up on the list higher towards first author the more you contribute to completing the final manuscript for submission. So for the initial investigators, the primary investigators, when there is a mistake, something like you've experienced with your co-authors, what is the responsibility to the 77th and 202nd co-author on those kind of papers, and what responsibility should they feel they should have taken in creating the manuscript?
Yeah, this is such a big challenge, especially for those many author papers where you can't possibly have everyone aware of, involved in every step of the process. So it is, two things are true simultaneously. Everyone named on the paper is responsible for the paper, and some of the people named on the paper are more responsible than others. And so the leadership of any project bears ultimate responsibility for what goes in. And all of us, to the extent that we have the capacity, the opportunity to do so, have a responsibility for the integrity and the ethical work done on that paper, both in the execution of it and then in the follow-on when stuff goes wrong. And in the multi-author situations, right, there are power dynamics, there's distributed roles, there's different awareness of what's happening in the project, and those add a lot of complication, especially in stressful moments of like a potential retraction where something went wrong, like that error. Who's responsible? How do we deal with this? And what are all the reputational stakes engaged? And those are complicated. And I think it ultimately is not different than the responsibilities we have for the affirmative, the submission of the paper, What is it that we are responsible for in saying this is our work and we did the best work we can? And in the challenging moments, is the distribution of responsibility is very similar. So that it's a hard answer because it's a hard question. So thank you for raising that.
Hello again. So with the conceptions that we have about psychology already, which are different in different cultures, I'm wondering if just the open, science have received any different reactions between like different cultures, like the US versus other countries. So I just wanted to know if you.
Yeah, great question. Yes, there is a lot of variation regionally. There is it is a very broad global movement. So for example, UNESCO has an open science program that is being is getting embraced by, I think they had like 79 countries as signatories. I can't remember. I made that number up, but it's a number. It might be that, it might be a different number. I don't know. But they have been really working to advance these principles across regions. And a lot of that discussion that's happening globally is what are the unique challenges within individual regions. U.S. is extremely well resourced on average. Of course, we know that the resource is not equally distributed across institutions within the U.S., right? One university with millions of dollars a year research budgets is a very different environment than a primarily teaching-oriented institution in terms of what's possible to do. That variation obviously exists in every country, and the U.S. is just off scale in some ways. But there's other issues too that's not just about resources. So for example, researchers in the global south will identify issues related to colonialism we generate this research, we generate valuable data, we make it open, and our very well-resourced northern counterparts say, great, thank you for the data, and publish it before we do because we don't have the capacity to do the research at the same pace. And we don't have the resourcing, we don't have the labs. So there's real concerns about how openness could exacerbate inequities rather than ameliorate them. Now that's a concern in part in theory, in part in anecdotal practice. And there's the reverse, which is openness of highly resourced labs that generate lots of very valuable data now suddenly are accessible to people that don't have the resources to generate enormous amounts of valuable data. So all those R1 universities that now have to share all their data because they have all of these NIH awards, now there is a massive market coming of secondary data that is very, very valuable data that before they just hoarded and get to churn out publication after publication. And now, wherever anyone is, as long as they have an internet connection, could access that data and do novel research with it. So my hypothesis, and it's only a hypothesis, is that on balance, openness will be an equity producer, but there are real risks based on the issues like you were identifying, of how people might be responding to this. I'll also just say as one side note, US is not as far along as the EU on this overall. So more progress has been made on open science in the EU.
Thank you. So to end out our roundtable, I have one final question, kind of in the theme of the. Did we have a question? Oh, should we? Yeah, we have time for one more. So either way, I can ask it.
Sorry. So I recently been doing a lot of trauma-informed approaches work, and this conference has a lot of emphasis on surveys and research, and it came to mind that certain strategies and methodologies are out of practice, and I just wanted to know how we should go about updating those, such as the ACEs studies that put a lot of emphasis on male being the violent person within homes and violence happening within homes, where a lot of trauma events happen outside of homes, or where women create a lot of traumas for their own children or other people's children. So if we wanted to update these methodologies, how will we go about doing that for our own research to be better and more improved and more transparent?
Yeah, a great question. There are unique issues in more qualitative approaches for transparency. One, of course, is protection of rights of the people that are being researched and their communities if there are risks there. And that can have some unique challenges in the types of methodologies that you're talking about. A second, but there's very active, for example, qualitative research community working on how do we do transparency more effectively? How do we do data sharing with our kinds of work? And I think you're also asking a deeper question is on the methodologies themselves and trying to critique and improve on those. And by and large, I think we're still in the world of communities themselves that are using the methodologies need to orient towards being skeptical of their own methods and constantly looking for ways that could innovation can occur. Because sometimes communities can sort of default to, this is just how we do things. And they stop thinking about what the limits of their methods are and stop innovating on actually improving them. And most areas of research, real advancement comes from methodological innovation, not theoretical innovation. Theoretical innovation follows because effective new methods open doors and provide data for insight that just didn't exist previously. An example in biology is the invention of PCR technique, dramatically transformed investigation, research, genomics area of research, because you can now sequence the gene in a way that you could just wasn't possible. So you couldn't even imagine the types of research that could be done until this technique was developed to do the work. So I think culturally for our field writ large is a much stronger emphasis on methodological innovation, and building on that will help not just the area of work that you're in, but all of our work. Thank you.
We're technically at our break time, so I think we should probably go ahead and wrap up instead of me asking my last question, sadly. So thank you so much to both of you. We have a 10-minute break here, and then we will come back in just a little bit.